lecture this year for the series on the forward generation. Programs, and of course, today's equity table is very good. And we also can think about maybe at the end of the program and the ideas for next year. We usually do. I did like give it over to Dan.
Okay. So, hello, everybody. I'd like to my own thanks to the friends back there for all the brownies I've been enjoying, and the candy, so in the coffee. So, thanks so much for everything you do. We are, like we just heard, on the very last episode now of our tale of the first voyages to the Antarctic and eventually the race to the South Pole, as you can see up here on the slide. And as I go through this description of ultimately how human beings actually got to the South Pole in 1911 and 1912, and you'll have to excuse the sort of awkwardness because I printed out my lecture all along, so it's actually looking like this. I've never actually done this before, so I might be courting disaster. Because the kind of thing that Amundsen would never have allowed to happen. He was a very good planner, meticulous planner, as we'll see. And if he had printers back then, he would have known exactly how to use it, and it would never have come out this way. But he was oh yeah, you would have picked landscape. That's very good. Yeah. Well, we need to get started, and that means going to the next slide to show us all where we are as of the winter of 1910, 1911. After, during the summer months, both the Scott party and the Amundsen party have left depots of supplies at various points on the Ross ice shelf. So, as we saw last time, this is Amundsen's winter quarters on the Bay of Whales. That's not too far away. Some of you may remember from the old American base of Little America, which doesn't exist anymore, but it did exist in the 1950s. It was covered by snow. A lot of it went out on an iceberg into the ocean. But close by Little America was Amundsen's quarters at the Bay of Whales. So you can see, I think, from the map that his route to the South Pole was a bit shorter than Scott's would be, as luck would have it for him. So that's where Amundsen is. And he laid depots of supplies very far into the ice shelf, all the way down a little bit past 82 degrees south. And Scott's base was over here on Ross Island on Cape Evans. And as we saw last time, he hadn't been able to lay supplies very far at all on the ice shelf, only as far as what they call 1 ton depot, as we'll see a little bit later. And one thing to keep in mind is that Scott could have gone a bit further into the ice shelf over the summer, but he was told by Titus Oates, his expert on horses, that based upon the condition of the ponies, that if you wanted to go a little bit further, the thing to do was to kill some of the ponies, lay them as a cache of meat for the next summer, and then go back having laid supplies a bit further south. That would have made sense. That's what Oates thought he should do. But he couldn't stomach the thought of what he saw as an unnecessary killing of a pony, or more than one pony. And so he was satisfied with not going too far south at all on the ice shelf with a 1 ton depot and no further than that. And that point will be significant a little bit later on. So that's where they were. And to maybe give you the last detail that's good to know, the advantage that Scott had, even though he was further away from his goal on the South Pole, was that he actually knew the route. Shackleton, remember, had pioneered the route through the Beardmore Glacier and onto the Pole Plateau that way. And in fact, Scott, gentleman that he was, asked Shackleton permission. Can I go your way? Can I go through the Beardmore? Shackleton said, yes, knock yourself out. There's no point to asking permission about something like that. But that was Scott for you, so he asked permission first. So he didn't know the way, he didn't know the route. Amundsen did not know exactly how he was going to get through those mountains, the Trans-Antarctic mountain range. He was going to trust to his own good luck, trust the fate to get through. And I think Scott probably felt in the back of his mind that one advantage he had was the possibility that Amundsen, when he actually got up to the mountains, wouldn't be able to find an easy way through and would eventually have to go back towards the west and actually take the Beardmore, the only way through that anybody knew about. And that would be time consuming. And if there was going to be a race to the South Pole, maybe that would mean that Scott would win. The other advantage that Amundsen was afraid Scott might have would be those motorized sledges that Scott had. Maybe they'd actually work on the ice shelf. Maybe that would allow him to transport a good bit of supplies when the time came. And Amundsen was so worried about that, that he was determined to get the earliest start he could in the spring and summer of 1911, going into 1912. So that's where we left them, spending the winter waiting for what was to come in the spring and the summer. Now we go to the next slide. This is where Amundsen and his men were. There were about a little over a dozen of them here at Trondheim. They're a prefabricated cabin that they had taken with them from Norway on the Fram. A pretty comfortable place to be. That's where they were going to spend the winter. Amundsen did everything he could to prepare for the journey to come. As I said before, he was a meticulous preparer. He seemed to think of everything. He pioneered a new kind of tent pole that would be easier to set up and that would hold tents more securely. Among other things, he was determined that any tent that went to the South Pole would be black. Why would it be a good idea to have a black tent? Obviously, it stands out of the snow. So if you were losing your way, you needed to find the tent. There it was. It'd be almost unmissable. Among other things, he saw to it that on the sledges that the dogs would pull to the South Pole, there was a built-in compartment for food. So all you'd have to do to get food is take the lid off, reach in, get the food, put the lid back on. What Scott had and what other polar parties had always had were separate boxes with the food. So you take them off the sledge, you'd have to get food out of there, then reload the boxes. That was time consuming. Why not just have a separate compartment on the sledge? So he saw to that. Another thing he saw to was that all the skis would have hooks on them. So if they wanted to, they could hook the skis up in the tent once they sent the tents up. And the reason they liked that idea was that the skis had these leather straps on them, and they were always afraid that dogs would get to the skis and gnaw on the leather straps. And this way they wouldn't be able to do it. The skis would be nice and snug, hooked up somewhere in the tent, if all went well. And all through the winter here in Trondheim, now we can go to the next slide, they were concerned with making sure that their boots were nice and insulated as possible. They were very upset on their initial journey to the ice shelf over the summer to find that the boots were not really much good. So they experimented for months in trying to make the boots as liable to protect them from frostbite as possible. They did everything they could in that respect. And here they are gathered around a sociable table at Trondheim in the winter of 1910, 1911. It's probably about 30, 40 degrees below zero, but you would never know it. They're in their shirt sleeves, very nice place to be. And that's Amundsen towards the back on the right, who would eventually, as we'll see, achieve his life's dream. Now, what he was really worried about were the motor sledges, and that meant he was going to try to get an early start. But in the meantime, they would keep their morale up. They would do a lot of reading. They would play records. They would have impromptu celebrations for almost any excuse. And one thing they did every day was they had a contest for who could get closer to the actual temperature outside. So this wasn't primarily a scientific expedition. This was an expedition to get to the South Pole. That's what it was all about. But they took readings, like you would expect them to do, and they had a contest at the end of the winter, who was going to get closest the most times to the temperature. And that contest was won by Hjalmar Johansen, the man, remember, who had spent 8 months in a hut with Fridtjof Nansen up in the Arctic several years before. And because he won the contest, he got a nice pair of binoculars that he would eventually take back with him to Norway. Now we can go to the next slide. Those are the Norwegians, and here is Robert Falcon Scott in his cabin where they were spending the winter at Cape Evans. He had always thought of this as largely a scientific expedition, a little bit different than the way Amundsen thought of it. And that meant he had about a dozen trained scientists along with him. Probably they weren't going to go to the pole, but they were going to do as much scientific research as they could: geology, meteorology, zoology, botany, if they could actually find something, anything that actually needed doing. And there were all sorts of scientific instruments all over this cabin, or a set of cabins that they had at Cape Evans. But because they were thinking of themselves as largely a scientific expedition, they made what I think was a fairly big mistake early on. And that had to do with one of the expedition members. We've already met him, Edward Billy Wilson. the guy that everybody liked, everybody depended on, do a lot of different things. And among other things, he was a very good ornithologist. And what Billy Wilson wanted to find out when he went down to the polar regions was, above all, what can we learn about penguins in their possible descent from dinosaurs, from the early reptiles many tens of millions of years ago. And to try to figure that out, what he wanted were penguin eggs, because he knew there was a colony of king penguins over on Cape Crozier on the other side of Ross Island. Actually, emperor penguins, I should say. I got my royalty mixed up. So you can go to the next slide, where we get an idea about the landscape. So here's Ross Island, and Scott and his men were at Cape Evans, which is here on that side of Ross Island. But at the very other end of Ross Island, on that side, there would be these emperor penguins, and Wilson really wanted the eggs. Now, this was the middle of winter. It's pitch darkness. At the other end of Ross Island is 65 miles away from Cape Evans. Let's go to the next slide. But these emperor penguins were beckoning to Billy Wilson. So Scott allowed him to take two men with him, Bertie Bowers, as it turned out, and a guy who'd become famous, aptly Terry Garrard, to go to the other side of Ross Island, to Cape Crozier, and try to find emperor penguin eggs. And here's where the quiz comes in. What do we call the famous scientific theory or principle that if you could just find an egg, for example, you could trace the origin and development of the species just by looking at the embryo and the egg? Anybody remember this? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's the idea. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So maybe we can prove that. We're just going to look at the emperor penguin egg, and maybe we can see traces of reptilian ancestry there in the embryo in the egg. But first, you got to get the eggs, and that means you got to go to Cape Crozier. Now, he cared much more about this, Billy Wilson did, than about getting to the South Pole. He wanted those eggs. So in June of 1911, in the middle of the winter, Scott allowed these three, Wilson, Bowers, and Cherry Garrard, to set out hauling sledges for the 65-mile trip to Cape Crozier in the middle of the winter. Those sledges had hundreds of pounds of equipment on them. And what that meant was they had to take turns. They'd haul one sledge. They get to that point, then they go back and get the other sledge, get back to the same point. And maybe they get, at the worst of it, maybe 2 miles a day doing that. And that was exhausting, but they got to get to the emperor penguin eggs. So that's what they did. The landscape, now if you go to the next slide, on the way to Cape Crozier was littered with crevasses. And they got to go all the way from here, Cape Evans, all the way to Cape Crozier, the other side of Ross Island. You can imagine how difficult that was. But luckily they were all roped together so that if one person plunged into a crevasse, the other two could make sure that they could pull this person out. And luckily they didn't all three go down into any one of them at any time. And they were able to get slow progress. It never got above 30 below zero the entire trip. 30 below zero is a nice balmy day on Ross Island on that trip. And to make, and this is the worst thing, to make matters worse, the closer they got to Cape Crozier on Ross Island, the windier it got, because the nature of Ross Island is that it's at the other end of where the southerly winds are blowing from the South Pole. So the winds are blowing cold off the South Pole to the north. And when they get to Ross Island, they spread out. All those winds spread out, east-west. And they were getting the brunt of those winds all the way to Cape Crozier. Somehow they kept going in this wind tunnel. And when they finally got to where the penguins were, they noticed, to their dismay, that to get the eggs, they would actually have to descend a 200-foot cliff. And it's pitch dark, right? It's the summer in the end, our summer, their winter. So they can't see anything. But down the cliff they went because they wanted to get the emperor penguin eggs. What happened, luckily, was that Bowers got a couple eggs, and Wilson got a couple eggs, and Cherry Garrard, he got a couple eggs. But imagine his mortification when on the way back up the cliff, he dropped the eggs, and they broke. All this way, he dropped the eggs. But luckily, they had 5 eggs. They had 5 eggs that survived. And shortly after getting the eggs, now they're back up the cliff. Now it's time to camp. The worst winds of all started blowing. They had made this igloo. The igloo, a lot of it was just blown away. And it was so bad that the tent they were in also blew away. So here they were, I think they spent like 36 hours and nothing but sleeping bags. They should have died there, but Bowers and Wilson kept singing the whole time to keep their spirits up. And luckily, the wind died down a little bit. They got out of the tent and they managed to got out of the sleeping bags and they managed to find the tent that had blown away. By the time they actually did that, the sleeping bags couldn't be folded up anymore. They were just frozen solid. But they got the tent. Now they decided, this is it. We got to get back to Cape Evans pretty soon. And the trip back, if anything, was worse than the trip to Cape Crozier. And it was so bad that Cherry Garrod's teeth were chattering so much he cracked his teeth. Cracked his teeth because they were chattering so much in the cold. Now we can go to the next slide, and here's what they look like. They're finally back at Cape Evans after this journey. That's Cherry Garrod on the right, Bertie Bowers in the middle, and the great Billy Wilson on the left. So they actually got the eggs. They got back to Cape Evans, and they found out that really they didn't find out anything new about those eggs. Scientists have already looked at Adelaide penguin eggs, and they probably knew everything they needed from them anyway. But they achieved this mission at the cost of wearing themselves out. Imagine how exhausted they were. One wonders if that was the best use of their time and energy, when they should have been saving up their time and energy for the trip, ultimately maybe to the South Pole. At any rate, the winter passed away after this famous winter journey to Cape Crozier. And then on September 8th, 1911, September 8th, that's not even the spring yet. It's still winter in the Arctic. But on September 8th, maybe 3 weeks after the sun first came out, Amundsen decided, I'm ready to go. I'm going to start. Now we go to the next slide. And his idea was to take about 6 companions with him, using dogs, of course, to pull the sledges on the ice shelf, and maybe steal a march on Scott and get to the South Pole as quickly as possible. It was freezing. It's terribly cold. It's only September 8th in the Antarctic. But he's going to go anyway. And making about 15 miles a day, he began to feel pretty good. He's getting to the depots. That's where the food was left the previous summer. And then the temperature just plummeted. Colder than he expected, even colder. The water in their compasses froze out there on the ice shelf. 2 of the dogs froze to death on the ice shelf, to the dismay of the Norwegians. And they got close to 80 degrees south. And then Amundsen made the decision, we can't go much further than this. The conditions are horrible. He got to 80 degrees. He left another depot there for the next trip. And he made the difficult decision to turn back. False start. And where the controversy comes in is that on the way back, in these very difficult, frigid conditions, ultimately the party was separated and Amundsen went on ahead, leaving others behind, including Hjalmar Johansen. And Amundsen got safely back to Framheim, but Johansen and the others straggled in a day or a couple of days after that. And as Amundsen was sitting around a table, in comes Hjalmar Johansen a little bit late. And Amundsen had the nerve to say, what kept you? What kept you? And Hjalmar Johansen, as you would too, exploded at Amundsen, blamed him for bad leadership. So there's no excuse for this. We should have all stayed together. And he was right about that. You can't imagine Shackleton ever abandoning his men on the ice shelf. They would have stayed together to the last. Amundsen, for the rest of his life, would talk about this. He had excuses for this. He had reasons. Not everybody buys the reasons that he had. A lot of people think of this as a failure of leadership on Amundsen's part. Maybe the only dark spot on his record, at least in Antarctica. At any rate, Amundsen would never forgive Hjalmar Johansen for blowing up at him like that. Now we can go to the next slide. And for that reason, Amundsen decided that Johansen would not go with him on the next trip to the South Pole, when he would next start out maybe in a month's time, maybe a bit vindictively. And Hjalmar Johansen was heartbroken by that. He would eventually go back with the Fram to Norway, and he killed himself a year later in 1913, after not getting the chance to go to the South Pole. Now this, I think, does show Amundsen at his best and his worst. At his worst, nobody can really explain why he let that party get separated on the ice shelf. But at his best, he was able to face facts. If he didn't turn back, that would have been a pointless loss of life. They weren't going to make it in these conditions. It must have been terrible not to turn back. But he did. It was the only decision to make. And that showed very good judgment. And he almost always showed very good judgment on any of these journeys, whether it's the Arctic or the Antarctic. And so for a month, he waited for better conditions back in Framheim. September changed to October. All the time he's worried. What if those sledges, those motorized sledges actually work on the other side of the ice shelf? Am I waiting too long? Well, he had no choice. Conditions just weren't right yet. But as soon as he could, October 18th, he set out again. Next slide. And to give you again an idea of the map, here is the Bay of Wales. He's going to have to try to get down here on the ice shelf. About that far is where he'd gone the last summer. Everything else was going to be unknown. I have no idea what was there and no idea how to get through the mountains. But on the 18th, he set out 4 sledges, 52 dogs, 4 comrades. Total of 5 men, 52 dogs in the 4 sledges. And among those he took with him was a champion skier, Olaf Jalmund. The British were taught to ski, remember, by Trygve Grant. We talked about that the last couple of weeks. They were never, obviously, going to be as good at skiing as the Norwegians. Among other things, the Norwegians had this medalist in skiing, Jalmund with them, Olaf Jalmund. So they followed the route they blazed the previous summer over the ice shelf, not knowing what awaited them when they got close to the mountains, as you see in the mid part of the screen. And they were plagued on the ice shelf by heavy fog. It's no fun when you're worried about falling through a crevasse on the ice. But they went further, making good time, 15 miles a day, not bad at all, on the ice shelf. And what kept making Amundsen feel better about all of this was the thought that if those motorized sledges didn't work for Scott on the other side of the ice shelf, he was certain to have gotten a later start than Amundsen. Everybody knew that if you've got dogs, you can get an earlier start. The dogs can take the cold better than ponies. If you depend on ponies, you got to start later in the season, more into the summer. So Amundsen had every reason to feel pretty good, although he couldn't be sure. What about those motorized sledges? Well, we'll have to see. So into the ice shelf they went. Now we get back ultimately to Scott. So now we leave Amundsen. It's the middle of October. He's going into the ice shelf. And what was going to happen with Robert Belt and Scott? Well, he would get a later start. Now we go to the next slide. Using their ponies, Manchurian ponies, as you see here, Teddy Evans in one party left Cape Evans in a little base bit to the south called Hut Point on October 24th. And Scott himself and his party left a week later, November 1st. And the idea was about a dozen of these Britishers, the Britons, are going to go south into the ice shelf. They're going to take the ponies and the dogs, they had some dogs with them, and the sledges as far as they can go, maybe up into the Beardmore Glacier. But at some point, the ponies, if they survive, the dogs, even the sledges, will be left behind, and the British would man-haul all the sledges and all the goods through much of the glacier and onto the Polar Plateau. And for the time being, everybody, like, there's going to be about 8 or 9 or 10 people going. But at some point, Scott would make the decision on the glacier, the Beardmore, who he would take with him on the final trip to the pole. Some of the British would go back, only 4 would go to the pole, Scott and 3 others. But that was the idea. The motorized sledges, guess what, failed very quickly. They made about 50 miles, stopping, starting. Eventually they had to be discarded. And from then on, it was ponies and a few dogs. Then the blizzard struck on the ice shelf. And when I say blizzards, what I mean is not falling snow. I mean heavy winds blowing the snow everywhere. That's what you would call a blizzard down there. The whole enterprise was in trouble from the beginning. Titus Oates was very worried about these ponies. Their forelocks were slipping into the snow as they had done before. They were making very slow time. More than ever, he wished he would have been the one to choose the ponies. But remember from last time, he wasn't. Somebody who didn't know about ponies chose them. And these, it turned out, were not perhaps as strong as they should have been. He did his best, but nobody's best was probably going to be good enough. He finally told Scott on the ice shelf, these ponies will be lucky to get them as far as the glacier. There's no way they're gonna make it up into the Big North Glacier. And that meant only one thing, that the ponies would have to be killed before going up into the glacier. And Scott hated that thought, didn't want to think about it. Always a problem for him, but there was no getting around it. Scott's party, which left later on November 1st, finally caught up with Teddy Evans, his second in command, on November 15th. Still on the ice shelf, still a long way behind where Amundsen was, because that was November 15th. 2 days later, November 17th, I think we can go to the next slide. Amundsen, using dogs, like you can see here, had already gotten up close to the mountains. The ice shelf was now behind him. They were in totally unknown territory. They were in the foothills of the Trans-Antarctic Range. Nobody had ever been to that part of the mountain. How are they going to get through? They figured they had about a week to look around and still be safe as far as the food was concerned. Now they're up to about 1,500 feet, looking for a way through. He wasn't sure he'd find one. But after looking around a little bit, now we go to the next slide, they found something maybe that would help. And this map maybe can show you what they were thinking. Here's Amundsen's route going this way, and he's got number 4 with him, 4 men. And here are the mountains. Over here is where they're trying to find a way through. And at one point, they're up 1,500, 1,750 feet, something like that. And they looked down and they saw a glacier. And the glacier was going more or less east-west in a transverse way, which would mean that going that way, they could find a way through like this and then make their way south towards the pole. Now, they weren't sure that would work, but maybe it was a possible way through. It wasn't going to be easy, but this might be their only chance. So Amundsen made the decision up on the heights to go down to the glacier, then go back up to the South Polar Plateau, staking everything on the idea that that glacier would actually work. But as I said, it's not going to be easy. They had to ski down a steep slope to get to the glacier with the dogs and sleds, something the British could never have done with their experience, but the Norwegians, they managed it. Once they were on the glacier, they had to avoid the crevasses. They would have to hope there were no avalanches from the surrounding peaks on either side. And once they got up the glacier, up to about 9,000, 10,000 feet, all that awaited them, as they could see, was a treacherous series of chasms, ice falls, that would be the barrier to the polar plateau. Somehow they'd have to navigate through that. Next slide. So they made the attempt. This is the Olaf Jalman, the champion skier. He led the way. If anybody could find a way through, he could, along with the dogs. The glacier they had found would enter history as the Axel Heiberg Glacier, named after a man who had financed a good bit of Amundsen's journeys in the past, and this was no exception, this trip to Antarctica, and he would give his name to the glacier forever afterwards. And if you want to, you can traverse the Axel Heiberg Glacier today. You can go the way Amundsen went. It's called extremely strenuous among those who rate these kinds of things, and it was very, very difficult. We sometimes make the mistake comparing Amundsen to Scott, believing that Amundsen's route to the South Pole was actually very easy, like a walk in the park. Well, it was anything but. The Axel Heiberg Glacier was extremely difficult enough to crack, more difficult than the Beardmore, as a matter of fact. But the experienced skiers among the Norwegians, and they were experienced, were up to the challenge. Up the glacier they went, 10,000 feet, and they got to the point where all they have left in front of them is the ice fall, chasms of ice that they got to negotiate their way through. And as they were preparing to go, having done this the hard way, there were other easier way through, maybe not too far away, but how could they have known that? They got to choose the way they see. That's their choice. Got no alternative here. As they began to get through those ice falls, Amundsen went up to the highest height that he could attain to get a lay of the land. And he looked down on the spectacle, the glacier this way, the ice fall that way, beckoning summer to the South Pole. And he wrote about what he saw. Once he was up there, this is what he wrote in his diary. It was a beautiful and impressive view. A beautiful, impressive view we had of our tent far below, surrounded on all sides by huge chasms and crevasses. The wildness of the landscape is indescribable. Pit after pit, crevasse after crevasse, huge ice blocks scattered helter-skelter. It was easy to see that nature here was at her mightiest. The grandeur of the scene was something none of the Norwegians would ever forget. There by the ice wall with the polar plateau ahead. If you go to the next slide, and this is part of what the Axel Heiberg Glacier looks like today. That's one of the easier parts, but most of it was not easy, to say the least. But they got through the chasm, they got through the ice wall, and they were now a bit over 250 miles from the South Pole. Like they knew one thing now, they were going to need fresh meat for the rest of the journey and to get back. And what that meant was they had to kill about 40 of the dogs. They had 52 dogs, they only needed 18. The reason they took so many was precisely for this moment. They had to be sacrificed to make the pole. None of the Norwegians wanted to do it. They all hated to do it. Each Norwegian who led a particular team was responsible for slaughtering the dogs in that team. That was their responsibility, and they took it. They called it the butcher shop, there at the foot of the ice fall. That's where the dogs had to be killed. But ultimately, they left with 18 best dogs to take with them to the pole. And now it's the beginning of the last week in November. They're on the polar plateau. It's not going to be easy, but beckoning in the distance is the goal. At that same time, the fourth week in November, next slide, Robert Falcon Scott and those are Greenland dogs, the kind of dog that Amundsen had with him. Next slide. At that same time, again, it's the end of November, beginning of the last week of November, Scott's party, still on the ice shelf, had to kill their first pony. Something Scott hated to think of, but there was no remedy for it. And now there are only 8 ponies left to get them as far in the ice shelf towards the glacier as they could go. The weather continued to be awful for Scott, worse than he thought it would be. Blizzards were ferocious, winds seemingly inexhaustible. By December 5th, they had not yet entered the Beardmore. By this point, of course, Scott was Amundsen was on the plateau on his way to the pole. Scott had never seen such conditions. And when things warmed up the next day, December 6th, that should have been good news. But all it did was it melted a bunch of the snow and the ice. Now they're all covered with moisture and water. They're all soaked. Scott called the place where they were the Slough of Despond. The Slough of Despond. Finally, they got to the Beardmore, December 9th, at the end of the day. And at that point, they did what they had to do. They killed the last of the ponies. And it'd be man-hauling, as you see here, from that point all the way into the Beardmore and onto the plateau. Unbelievably, Billy Wilson was happy to be man-hauling. He said, "Thank God we begin now the heavier work ourselves." You could never imagine a Norwegian saying that. Thank God we're man-hauling now. Bernie Bowers wrote that man-hauling would show that the British race was capable of as much hardy endurance as ever. Now, these ideas, of course, incomprehensible to us, to the Norwegians, but it was second nature to these Edwardians. That was their culture. And at that point, when they began to man-haul all this stuff up the Beardmore Glacier, from about 1,000 feet up to 10,000 feet, up the glacier towards the plateau. At that point, Amundsen and the Norwegians, 5 of them, were skidding along the whole plateau behind the dogs. Amundsen and his men got to 88 degrees, 23 south. That was Shackleton's old record. And they stopped there on the plateau. Once they got there, and they wanted to commemorate the moment, they raised the Norwegian flag, at least temporarily at that point. And Amundsen later wrote that his goggles began to freeze up or begin to be impossible to see through. But it wasn't perspiration, of course, it was tears that they had gotten to this moment. They had beaten Shackleton. Nobody had ever been that far south or farther south before. For them, the pole was now 97 miles away. Here we are in early December 1911. They kept going. The only thing they had to worry about now was the dreadful thought of peering off one day into the distance and seeing something black. And what that would mean was that Scott had somehow gotten first. That's what they were worried about. They had a really bad moment on December 12th. Really close to the pole now. But on December 12th, they could see something dark. They could see something black up there in the distance. And a sinking feeling was palpable to those who saw it. But then they did a little investigating and they found that some of the dogs had left some droppings. And the mirage effect magnified the dog droppings into something they thought was man-made. It's actually dog-made. And they didn't mind that. That meant that they were probably going to be first. That was the 12th. On the morning of December 14th, go to the next slide. This is where they are, right almost there. Past the Antarctic mountains, very close to their goal. And on that morning, December 14th, the rest of the Norwegians told Amundsen, you go ahead. You go ahead, because they knew that was the day, based upon their reckoning, that they would make the pole. Next slide. And in fact, they were right. December 14th, 1911, Amundsen and the Norwegians made it to the South Pole. It was a glorious afternoon, a day of triumph for Amundsen, but also a day of irony. He mentioned this in his diary. You can think of it too. Amundsen probably holds the record for the person who came the nearest of a direct opposite. It's what he'd always dreamed of doing. He always dreamed of going to the North Pole, and here he was at the South Pole. You can't get any further away from your dreams than that. He thought that was kind of funny. That's one of the first things he thought about in his diary. But it was really a day of great triumph. All the Norwegians spontaneously shook hands when they were pretty sure they were at the South Pole. That's the tent they set up. Now we go to the next slide. And what they all did was they joined hands, all five of them, joined hands on the pole of the Norwegian flag. And they planted the flag all together at the pole. And you may wonder, how can they be sure they're right at the South Pole? Well, they were wondering that too. So they spent the next 3 days walking all around the circumference of where they were, tramping up, like boxing the South Pole. So no matter where they were, at some point they had to be at the South Pole. And they put up black flags everywhere. We're here, we're here, we're here, we're here. They're not going to leave anything to chance. So they camped there at what they called Polheim, city at the pole, Polheim, for 3 days. And the last thing they did was they left their tent where it was, their black tent, and they left a little message for Barbara Falcon Scott. And the message said this, dear Captain Scott, as you are probably the first to reach this area after us, I will ask you to kindly forward this letter to King Haakon VII. If you can use any of the articles in the tent, please feel free to do so. With kind regards, I wish you a safe return. Yours truly, Amundsen. And I did want to mention that they got to the pole on December 14th. On that very day, on the other side of the ice shelf, their countryman Trygve Graham was making his way back to Cape Evans. And he had a dream at that same time that Amundsen had got to the South Pole. He never dreamt it before, he never dreamt it afterwards, but he dreamt it that day, that Amundsen actually got there. On December 18th, finally in the morning, they decided to head back to Trondheim. And this time, they were going to more or less take their time. They were in no great hurry now. Why should they hurry? They knew Scott hadn't gotten there yet. If they were going to be worried about anything, is are we actually going to find the depots we left where the food is? It's going to be blowing snow, it's going to be cold. Well, they wouldn't have to worry about that too much because remember, Amundsen thought about everything. One thing he decided to do was put rows of flags away from where the depots were. So 100 yards this way, a bunch of black flags, 100 yards that way, a bunch of black flags. So even though you might just miss it without the black flags, you'd always see the flags. You just follow the flags and you would get to the depot. That's where the food was. And they had a bunch of depots set up. So they weren't too worried about that because now they knew they could find them. And that was on December 18th, the day they began to go back to Trondheim in triumph, the 5 Norwegians. Now we go to the next slide. At that point, on December 18th, Scott and his men, Teddy Evans in one party, Scott in another, were man-hauling those sledges up the Beardmore. They were still on the glacier. They hadn't gotten past the mountains yet. Up towards 10,000 feet, up towards the plateau. They were suffering from hunger by now. They were suffering from various degrees of snow blindness. Scott's men didn't have goggles nearly as good as Amundsen's, not good for your eyesight, of course. Scott had terrible stomach pains that were probably going to plague him for the rest of the journey. And to make matters worse, once they got on the Beardmore, you can see a little bit of it here. There was a snow cover there on the Beardmore that Shackleton hadn't had to worry about when he was there. There's something good about that. That meant it was less likely they could fall through a major crevasse if the snow cover, nice layer of snow. But the bad thing about it was it's much more difficult to haul those sledges on that surface, that kind of snow surface, than it was for the ice that Shackleton was dealing with. And that meant that they would never make it the time they should have. This was very slow, the man hauling, and they're still over 200 miles away from the South Pole. But they finally got towards the end of the Beardmore, and there's the polar plateau in front of them. Now it was time for Scott to choose who would go with him to the pole. Some would go back to Cape Evans, others would go to the pole. By this point, Scott had fallen out with the second in command, Teddy Evans, Lieutenant Teddy Evans, who probably thought all the time that he would go to the pole with Scott. But that wasn't going to happen. Scott had more or less turned against Teddy Evans. Instead, what Scott did was this, very mysteriously, he went to Teddy Evans' tent, sent everybody else out, and basically said, you're not going to go with me. But the next thing he said was, can you spare Bertie Bowers from your team? The bad thing about that was Scott had always said 4 men go to the pole. Now he was going to choose a 5th man, Bertie Bowers, who was in Teddy Evans' group. That is not perhaps a wise thought to have, because if you made all your plans as Scott had regarding food and supplies for 4 men to the pole and 4 men back to Cape Evans, why would you have a 5th man? That means it's going to throw all your plans askew. What that meant was what was going to last 4 weeks for 4 men would only last maybe 3.5 weeks for 5. You can do the math yourself. Was there going to be enough food taking 5 men? Why would he do this? Why would he take Bertie Bowers? The other bad thing about it was, for reasons known only to him, a day back on the glacier, Scott had told Teddy Evans in his group, leave your skis behind. Man haul on foot. And that meant that Bertie Bowers didn't have skis. And yet, with 4 men with skis, they were going to take a 5th man without skis. Did that make sense? Because if 5 men are going to pull a sledge, there's going to be 2 with skis here, 2 with skis here, Bowers in the middle on foot. He could never really keep up, never really make the speed that anybody could on skis. And yet he was going to be on the team. Why do this at the last minute? Amundsen almost never made split-second decisions like this. Scott, however, typically did that, spur-of-the-moment decisions. It's never been adequately explained. The only reason maybe you take Bertie Bowers was he was very good at taking readings from the sky. Maybe that way you know when you get to the South Pole. But somebody else could have done that. Somebody else could have been trained to do that. Why do this at the last minute? Nevertheless, as silly as this seems, he made that decision. And on to the Polar Plateau they went. 5 men, not 4. Bertie Bowers, Edgar Evans from Wales, remember, Titus Oates, Billy Wilson, and Robert Falcon Scott himself. Why would Titus Oates go? Titus Oates knew about ponies. He was a horse expert. He was not the strong hauler that some of the others were. And in fact, he was no shape to go. His frostbite was getting worse, especially in his big toe. The last thing you want to go if you're going to haul is your big toe, and that was beginning to fade from frostbite. It's giving him a lot of pain. But Scott asked him to go, and Oates could have very well say no if your leader asks you to go. Not being Titus Oates, not being an Edwardian, the sensible thing was to say, I can't go, I'm going to go back. No, he's going to go. He was asked to go, and he would. And the last sight that Teddy Evans and the others saw as the men went onto the Polar Plateau to go south, and as the rest of them prepared to go back to Cape Evans, was Titus Oates forlornly looking back, waving from the Polar Plateau. And with that, 5 men went south. Oates not only was suffering frostbite, now he was showing signs of scurvy. And the others would as well as time went on. Edgar Evans, burly, strong, had a very badly wounded hand. And in those conditions, that wasn't going to get any better either. But on to the south they went in extreme cold. Cold that produced these sharp edges of ice that slowed down the sledges as they hauled them ever further south, ever further south. And then the blizzard struck up again as the polar party made its way. But on January 9th, a month after Shackleton had been approaching the pole, on January 9th, they finally passed Shackleton's point, 88 degrees 23, a short ceremony of commemoration, and then they kept going. Now, despite everything, their spirits were rising. They were nearing the pole, nearing the pole. The only thing they worried about, the same thing the Norwegians were worried about, something dark, something black in the horizon. So they peered into the horizon January 10th, 11th, 12th. Scott wrote this in his diary. The only thing I'm worried about, the potential sight of the Norwegian flag. Quote, an appalling possibility. A few more days of hard travel. Then, January 16th, Bertie Bowers peered into the distance. And indeed, he saw something discolored, something not white. They hoped it was just a big hunk of strange ice. But the closer they got, the more they knew that wasn't what it was. It was one of the black flags that Amundsen and his men had left as they blocked the pole a month before. The sight was demoralizing. Probably demoralizing beyond words. But Scott, in his diary, always tried to find the right words. So here's what he said. The worst has happened. Or nearly the worst. The next day, dejected, suffering more from frostbite. Their spirits, as low as you can imagine, they got to the point where the Norwegian flag was facing them right by the tent. We go to the next slide. Here they are hauling, this happens to be hauling on the ice shelf to give you an idea what it looks like. Then we go to the next slide. And here they are. Of course, somebody had to take the picture, but that's a Scott on the left, I believe. That's Bertie Bowers right by the tent. So they just found Amundsen's tent. And you can almost see by their postures how unhappy they are. They're second to the pole, not first. So they milled around a little bit. The only consolation that Bowers had, and he put this in his diary, was at least he showed what's possible by good British man-hauling. That's what he put it, good British man-hauling. So that's, of course, the middle of January. By that time, Amundsen and the Norwegians were back on the ice shelf, making their way back to Framheim. The Norwegians got back on January 25th, after a journey of 99 days, less than they thought it would take them, 10 days less than they thought it would take them. And they had a big celebration of Framheim, of course. And then it was time for the prom to go. First stop, Tasmania, Hobart, where Amundsen would send a telegram that would alert the world that Norway had made it to the pole, and that he had named the entire area after King Haakon VII, King Haakon VII's plan. But for these guys, Scott and the four others, what to do? Nothing for it now, but to make the long, weary way back to Cape Evans. Now we go to the next slide. This is the famous picture that was taken of them by automatic camera, I guess, at the South Pole. So that's Titus Oates, Bertie Bowers, that's Barbara Falcon Scott, and that's Billy Wilson, and that's Edgar Evans. You remember Edgar Evans from last time? He was the one that really angered Teddy Evans because he was trying to get back on the ship in New Zealand and he fell in the harbor. And Scott took him along anyway because he was such a strong, dependable guy. And here he is, about as upset as anybody else at the South Pole. They got to go back. They got to hope they can find the food depots to get back to Cape Evans. So they hauled the sled, filled with all that equipment, all those supplies, away from Polheim towards the Beard War once more. And none of them were in good condition. They had food, they had pemmican. As long as they had heat, they could heat it up, make what's called boosh, nice stewy pemmican, that would be nourishing. They had biscuits, but how long would the food last? Because now there were 5 men, not 4. The planning had all been for 4, but there were 5. Then they must have been uneasy as they made their way back, especially because Edgar Evans's hand is getting worse and worse. This wounded hand every single day. Billy Wilson, the ornithologist, the artist, likable and treasured by everybody, his spirits were descending because he was experiencing increased leg pain by now. Imagine hauling when your leg is giving you pain every single step. And Titus Oates' big toe is now pitch black with frostbite. With little margin of error, they got back to the Beardmore about the same time Amundsen was sailing away in the Palm to Tasmania. And they began descending down the glacier towards the ice shelf. They had about 5 days worth of food on the sled, 5 days to the next depot. They were cutting it pretty close, but they had good weather. And what Scott decided to do on a day of really good weather was go prospecting and find geologic samples that he could put on the sled. 35 pounds more of weight went on the sledge because the rocks were interesting. They looked like they were fossilized plants on the rocks. And remember, he thought of this as a scientific expedition. He wanted to prove that. So onto the sledge, already heavily loaded, went those rocks. And down the Beardmore they went, ever closer to the ice shelf, despite everything. Despite the fact that none of them were in good condition. They might have made it all the way back to Cape Evans if only they had that little immeasurably important spring to their step, that being the first to the pole would have given them. If only they had that adrenaline, knowing that the world was about to celebrate them as heroes, they probably would have made it despite everything, but they didn't have that. It's the opposite of that. They were dejected on the way back. How were they going to make it? Bad physical condition, low morale. Determined, however, down the Beardmore they went, hoping to find the food depots. 5 men, soon to be 4, on February 17th, Petty Officer Edgar Evans finally died. At least there were 4, not 5. Onto the ice shelf they went. After a very bad week on the glacier, the hauling was terrible on the ice shelf. Temperatures went way below what they expected. Late February, March, the temperatures were far colder than they usually were, far colder than what they expected, making this a set of ice crystalline surfaces on the ice shelf that seemed to make it especially hard to haul that sledge. But they kept hauling it. They kept hauling it. A terrible thing occurred when they got to one of their major depots on the ice shelf. They reached up to the point where the heating oil was. And they depended upon the heating oil to heat the snow for water and to heat up the pemmican to give them push, to give them a little bit of warmth. But it had been left up too high on this cairn, and the rays of the sun had vaporized a lot of the oil. And much of it was unusable now. And to make matters worse, they found some of the pony meat that had turned rotten somehow in the meantime. And now with provisions dangerously low, they had to face the terrible man. The fact was that hauling the way they were, of course they had to use way more calories, way more food than the Norwegians did with the dogs. And that meant, although for the Norwegians there would have been enough food, not for them, because they had to expend too much energy hauling those sledges day in, day out on the ice shelf. All of them now suffering terrible frostbite. On March 6th, Titus Oates had to admit the frostbite was too much. He couldn't haul anymore. He had to wander alongside the sledge, leaving the other 3 to haul that sledge painfully, slowly on that difficult freezing surface on the ice shelf. And then, very famously, a little over a week later, they're now 25 miles from the major depot they've got to get to, 1-ton depot. And at that point, another blizzard blew up. They're all in the tent together. And Titus Oates on March 17th, 1912, turned to Scott and said, I'm just going out for a while. I may be some time. And he decided to sacrifice himself for the others so that maybe they'd have more food. And he wandered out into the blizzard, was never seen again. And the other 3 knew what he had done, that he had died, believing that he was now useless to them, and maybe save the rest of them. The sadness of that is also accounted for by the fact that March 17th was Titus Oates' birthday. And that's when he died, on his 32nd birthday, amidst the waste of the Ross ice shelf, far away from the ponies and the horses he loved. And in fact, the British Isles, which he loved more than anything. Nobody knows where his body is, because it's there on the ice shelf. Finally, they got a little bit further north, a little bit further on the ice shelf. But then on the 19th of March, another blizzard blew up, as bad as anything they've seen. And remember, the temperatures are almost beyond endurance. So into tent once more, the three of them went, the wind blowing all around them, the 20th, the 21st, the 22nd. All they needed to do was get another 11 miles. Another 11 miles would have gotten them to 1 Ton Depot, where there was a lot of food. But you'll recall that the place where they were could have been a place for the depot if only the prior summer Scott had heeded Oates' advice and gone further south on the ice shelf, even if that meant the sacrifice of a couple of the ponies. And now he was paying the price for not going further south to lay a depot the previous summer. Now they were stuck in that tent. And every day they would look out the bottom of the tent. Every day they would open the flap, and the wind kept blowing and blowing, and the snow kept blowing. 8 days they're in the tent. Nobody knows if the blizzard actually went on for 8 days. In Scott's diary, he said it's an 8-day blizzard. It could be that maybe the blizzard did let up a bit, but they just didn't have the strength, even in moderate conditions, to keep going by then. Hungry, starving now, all of them in various degrees of physical debility. They sat in the tent as the blizzard raged around them. And then finally, on March 29th, Scott opened up his diary for the last time in his life. And this is what he wrote. These are his last words. "We shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course. The end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott." And then a postscript addressed to the people of Great Britain. "For God's sake, look after our people. For God's sake, look after our people." Wilson, Bowers, and Scott died of starvation in their tent. Maybe later in the day on March 29th, maybe the 30th, we'll never know. But the last few days of March, they perished of exposure, but mostly starvation, and lingering effects of scurvy, which by then would have set in pretty measured. Their bodies would eventually be discovered in November of 1912. So now we can go to the next slide. Cherry Garrard, who we met on the famous expedition to Cape Rozier, he would eventually lead a party to find out what happened to them. And in November, they came across the tent. They opened up the tent flap, and there were the frozen bodies of Bowers, Scott, and Wilson. Scott died with his arms around Wilson, like that, his right arm. And they decided to collapse the tent, leaving the canvas over the three explorers. And they built the best cairn they could, as you see here, over the bodies to mark the spot where they were. And they were the last people ever to see that cairn, I believe, because the nature of conditions on the ice shelf is that glacial ice will eventually overcome those areas. And right now, that cairn, if it exists at all, is on about 52 feet of ice. And in about 250 years, it's going to be out in the Southern Ocean. Yeah, it will break off. Just as Little America eventually broke off as an iceberg, so eventually this will too. The relief party that found them tried to find where Titus Oates was. They never could find his place, but they found what they thought might have been the place where he could have died, and they left a small marker there as well. But nobody will ever see that. It's gone for good under the ice. Amundsen would go home, of course, a national hero. And the postscript to his story is he eventually went to Great Britain before the British knew what happened to Scott. So here we're in 1912 now, it's the summer in the Northern Hemisphere in 1912. And Amundsen gave a famous speech at the Royal Geographic Society describing his expedition, describing what they did. And he was then insulted by the British. Lord Curzon, I think, leader of the Royal Geographic Society, one of them, basically said to Amundsen and to the assemblage of people gathered there that we should just drink to the dogs. He had nothing to do with it, obviously. The dogs did everything. I would agree we should drink to the dogs. But it was Amundsen's planning, his understanding of polar conditions, his insistence on facing facts that actually got to the pole, and the British would not give him credit for that. And for years and years, Amundsen, for the rest of his life, bore a grudge against the British for that attitude they took when he spoke to them in 1912. So now we go to the next slide. Eventually, news arrived back in Britain that Scott and his party were dead. Kathleen Scott would give the world this sculpture of her husband, Robert Falcon Scott, and other sculptures of Scott live in the old British Empire to this day. He was considered a great hero for really the next 50 years or so, even though he had not really achieved his goal to be the first. Recent revelations, of course, especially by the writer Roland Hunchford, demonstrated all the different mistakes that Scott made. Others have tried to reestablish his reputation. But one way or the other, Scott would be one of the great heroes of the last stage of the British Empire. A great failure, but somebody who showed bravery and endurance, even in pain. And the British did take care of their people. Kathleen Scott got a pension. Mrs. Evans got a pension, as did Mrs. Bowers. Now we go to the next slide. There's Amundsen as he looked towards the end of his life. Does anybody know how Amundsen died? He was an adventurer to the last. Umberto Nobile, the famous Italian explorer, was for a while stuck in the Arctic on a dirigible. Nobody knew what became of him. Eventually, everybody would be rescued. Amundsen died trying to find out where he was. He got in a rescue mission for Umberto Nobile. Now we go to the next slide. And that's the Amundsen Scott station. That's now at the South Pole. So manned all year round. You can't get to it in the winter, the Antarctic winter, but there's somebody there all the time, nothing but 80 people in the winter. But named after, of course, Amundsen and Scott, the first two to get to the South Pole. And now we go to the next slide. This is an example of the commemoration of Robert Falcon Scott. This is the Warwickshire stained glass window. And you can make out Titus Oates on the left, leading the tent on his last walk. And that's the relief party that eventually found the cairn and eventually established the cairn at the place where Scott, Bowers, and Evans died. Now we go to the next slide. And this is the monument to the Norwegians. And I haven't really mentioned their names, so I thought I should. This is Northstar Oslo. The first people to get to the South Pole, Roald Amundsen, leader of the expedition, Helger Hansen, Olav Jalland, the champion skier, Oskar Wirting, and Sverre Hassel. Those were the first people to get to the South Pole. And there they are. And I think that's it. Offered that time. But I really appreciate all of you attending these sessions. It's always so good to come to Bedford. I tell you this every year, but the reason I'm always looking forward to these sessions with you is that I get to talk about things that I've come to like and enjoy, and I really can't do that in my teaching career. I can't teach a class on polar exploration. They never let me do that. I'll do that here. This is a great fun to see all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you to the friends again.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, go ahead.
What became of Shackleton? Wasn't he,
Oh,
did he
yeah.
mount another expedition?
He did indeed. He wanted to transverse all of Antarctica. He wanted to go across the whole continent. But remember, that was the expedition where they were stuck on Elephant Island because of winter conditions were worse than they expected. The endurance was ice thin. And that was Shackleton's famous, against all odds, almost impossible journey from Elephant Island to South Georgia to get help for his men. That he's now more famous for than anything, that famous journey to South Georgia. Shackleton would die in the South Atlantic on his way back to Antarctica in the early 1920s. And his body is still there on South Georgia.
You visited.
Yeah, they went there.
Had a glass of champagne.
Oh, good. You can still see the prom in Norway. Has anybody seen the prom? You've seen it? That's a big attraction in Norway. Yeah, they're very proud of the prom. Greatest vessel ever made for polar exploration to this day.
It's very small when you think about it.
There's a tiny crew. Nansen took a small crew, so did Amundsen. There are only about 14 men, I think, in the whole, maybe 18 in the whole expedition. On the
But
prom.
to be able to survive in those conditions on that. Nothing.
Yeah. Well, you needed a good leader to keep up morale in those conditions. And both Amundsen and Shackleton were good at that.
Very, very popular in Norway.
Yeah. So now you can think about what you might want to do for next year too. You can do that on your own if you like.
Equator exploration?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that might be good. There's so many different possibilities. But if anybody wants to send an idea to Richard, they'll have your email address probably. So
Just let me know.
let him know, let me know. And if all goes well, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, Dan.
Need some brownies on your way.
Well, yeah, it's all down.